The salt-laced wind, sharp and insistent, whipped strands of Dean's hair across his eyes, clinging to the dampness on his cheeks. He stood on the deck of the small, battered ferry, a lone figure against the gray expanse of the sea and sky. The mainland, a distant smudge of green and brown, receded with every churn of the propeller, pulling him further into an isolation he craved, yet simultaneously feared. He clutched the worn leather strap of his satchel, his knuckles white, the worn leather a small comfort against the vast emptiness inside him. The journey had been long, each mile a deliberate severance from the life he'd left behind, a life now scarred beyond recognition. He'd packed only essentials, leaving the rest to gather dust, a testament to a grief too heavy to carry. The cartographer in him, usually meticulous and precise, found no solace in mapping the contours of his own despair. He was adrift, and this remote island, a speck on the ocean's immense canvas, felt like the only logical destination. It was his grandfather's island, his grandfather's cottage, a legacy he'd never expected, a final, desperate offering from a man he'd barely known. As the ferry cut through the choppy water, a thick, insistent fog began to roll in, swallowing the horizon. It draped itself over the waves, obscuring the sky, pressing down on the vessel until the world shrank to a churning circle of gray and white. Dean felt it seep into his bones, a cold dampness that mirrored the chill in his spirit. He watched the bow slice through the opaque veil, the sound of the engine muffled, distant. The island, when it finally emerged from the swirling vapor, was a brooding silhouette, jagged and dark, crowned by the skeletal finger of the abandoned lighthouse. The ferry docked at a rudimentary wooden pier, groaning under the weight of the water. Only a handful of passengers disembarked, all locals, their faces etched with the island's harsh realities. They glanced at Dean with a mixture of curiosity and wary resignation, a familiar outsider arriving to disturb their quiet rhythms. A grizzled deckhand helped him with his single trunk, its contents a collection of old maps, drafting tools, and a few threadbare clothes, the remnants of a life stripped bare. "Cottage is a fair walk," the deckhand grunted, pointing a calloused finger towards a winding, overgrown track that disappeared into the fog-shrouded hills. "Up past the point. It's been empty a long time." Dean nodded, offering a tight smile. He hoisted his satchel higher, the trunk a dead weight in his hand, and began his ascent. The path was narrow, barely more than a sheep trail, slick with damp moss and strewn with pebbles. The fog pressed closer, muffling the distant cries of gulls, distorting the shapes of the stunted, wind-battered trees that clawed at the sky. He walked for what felt like an hour, the path winding upwards, the abandoned lighthouse appearing and disappearing through the shifting mists like a spectral sentinel. What had driven him here? What had he seen in the endless expanse of the ocean? Finally, the path crested a rise, and through a momentary thinning of the fog, Dean saw it. The cottage. It was a squat stone structure, huddled against the relentless wind, its slate roof stained with lichen, its windows like vacant eyes. It sat low, almost swallowed by the wild, unkempt heathland that stretched to the cliff's edge. A rusted iron gate hung askew on one hinge, groaning softly in the breeze. Beyond it, a narrow, cracked flagstone path led to the heavy oak door. The garden was a tangle of thorny bushes and weeds, long past any semblance of cultivation. He could almost feel the weight of decades of neglect, the slow decay of a place abandoned to the elements. This wasn't just a house, it was a tomb of forgotten time. The oak door was heavy, resistant, and smelled faintly of mildew and old wood. He found the key, a large, ornate thing, tucked beneath a loose stone near the threshold, just as the solicitor had described. It turned in the lock with a groan of protest, echoing loudly in the stillness. He pushed the door open, stepping into the profound gloom within. The air was stagnant, thick with the scent of damp stone, salt, and an indefinable earthy smell that clung to the back of his throat. Dust motes danced in the sparse light that filtered through the grime-streaked windows, illuminating the forgotten furniture shrouded in yellowed sheets. The floorboards creaked beneath his boots, a chorus of old wood settling. He could hear the insistent murmur of the sea, a constant low thrum against the cliffs, and something else. A subtle rhythmic drip somewhere deep within the house, like a slow, measured heartbeat. His fingers brushed against a faint etching, a series of crude, unfamiliar symbols carved into the surface. They looked old, worn smooth by countless touches. Dean traced one, a spiral within a triangle, feeling a prickle of unease. His grandfather had been a man of few words, fewer possessions. Why these symbols? He walked to the nearest window, wiping away a layer of grime to peer out. The fog had intensified, a solid wall of gray. He felt a profound sense of isolation, a crushing weight of solitude. As he turned from the window, a flicker of movement caught the edge of his vision. He blinked, shaking his head. It was just the light, playing tricks. He was tired, his mind playing tricks. He told himself it was nothing. He stood in the center of the room, listening, his own breath catching in his throat. The path clawed upwards, a precarious ribbon of crumbling shale and tenacious gorse. Each step jarred Dean's bones, the trunk's weight a constant dull ache in his hand, his satchel digging into his shoulder. The air grew heavier still, thick with the expected scent of brine and decaying seaweed, but underscored by a faint metallic tang he couldn't quite place, like old blood or rust. He kept his gaze fixed on the ascent, refusing to look back at the boatman's fading silhouette, refusing to acknowledge the vast, indifferent ocean stretching behind him. Finally, the incline softened. Before him, nestled into the rocky outcrop, stood the cottage. It was smaller than he remembered from the old photographs, a squat gray stone structure with a slate roof that seemed to hunker against the incessant wind. Windows, filmed with salt spray, stared out like vacant eyes. A single rusted iron lantern hung beside the front door, its glass long since shattered. Beyond it, a little further up the rise, the abandoned lighthouse stood sentinel. A skeletal finger against the bruised sky, its broken lens, a void. The lock groaned in protest, a sound like an old man clearing his throat before giving way. He set the trunk down with a thud that echoed in the small space, dust motes dancing in the thin shafts of light filtering through the grimy windows. The cottage was sparse. A rough-hewn table, 2 chairs, a narrow cot draped with a moth-eaten blanket. His grandfather had lived a simple life, or perhaps a desperate one. He wiped down surfaces with a damp cloth, trying to scrub away not just the grime, but the lingering presence of a life he knew nothing about. The simple act of cleaning was a grounding exercise, a way to impose order on the chaos he felt within and around him. He unpacked his few belongings: maps, drawing instruments, a worn paperback, a change of clothes. Each item placed carefully, deliberately. As dusk began to paint the western sky in hues of bruised purple and angry orange, Dean found himself drawn to the window overlooking the sea. He'd always found solace in the ocean's rhythm, its predictable ebb and flow. But tonight, something felt off. The tide, which should have been steadily receding, seemed to hesitate, then surge forward with an unnatural haste, swallowing more of the rocky foreshore than he expected. It was as if the sea was breathing erratically, a giant, restless sleeper. He frowned, leaning closer to the glass. Perhaps it was just the peculiar currents around the island, an anomaly he, as an outsider, hadn't yet learned to anticipate. He tried to rationalize it, to find a logical explanation in the complex interplay of lunar pull and underwater topography. At first, he dismissed them as the wind, howling through the chimney and rattling the loose panes. But as the night deepened, the sounds grew more distinct, like voices carried on the gale. They weren't words, not exactly, but a low, guttural murmur, a shifting chorus of sound that seemed to rise and fall with the wind's intensity. He strained to catch a phrase, a single intelligible syllable, but it remained just out of reach, a maddening, indistinct drone. It scraped at the edges of his perception, making the hairs on his arms prickle. He was tired, he reasoned, and alone. Such things were to be expected. He rose, restless, and began to explore the cottage more thoroughly. There wasn't much to see. A small kitchen area, a cramped bedroom. He knelt, his fingers tracing the corroded latch. It opened with a sigh, revealing a jumble of old tools, tarnished brass instruments, and a thick, leather-bound journal. The journal felt heavy in his hands, its cover warped and stained by water damage. The pages within were brittle, some stuck together, others frayed at the edges. His grandfather's handwriting, usually precise and neat in the few letters Dean remembered, was here frantic, almost illegible in places. Many pages were filled not with text, but with disturbing sketches. Crude, unsettling drawings of swirling currents, of distorted, elongated figures with too many limbs, their eyes like black pits. He flipped through, a growing unease coiling in his stomach. Then he saw it, scrawled across a 2-page spread, almost tearing through the fragile paper. The Deep Song. The words were underlined multiple times, surrounded by more frantic scribbles that looked like desperate warnings. Below it, a sketch of a vast, gaping maw, not quite fish, not quite whale, but something ancient and terrible, rising from a vortex of churning water. He ran a thumb over the faded ink. His grandfather had been a recluse, alone on this island for decades. It wasn't uncommon for solitude to breed eccentricity, for a mind to conjure specters in the vast, empty canvas of the sea. The sketches were vivid, yes, but merely the product of an overactive imagination, a lonely man's descent into obsession. The water damage, the isolation, the sheer amount of time his grandfather had spent here, it all contributed to a picture of a man slowly unmoored from reality. He shivered again, pulling his threadbare blanket tighter around him. The fog pressed against the cottage windows, a damp, gray shroud that seemed to muffle the very passage of time. Dean sat hunched over the rough-hewn table, the grandfather's journal splayed open before him. The oil lamp cast a flickering, jaundiced glow on the brittle pages, illuminating the frantic, spidery script. His fingers traced the faded ink, the smell of ancient paper, and something faintly metallic clinging to the parchment. He was determined, a stubborn knot of resolve tightening in his gut. There had to be answers here, a key to the unsettling whispers that now seemed to echo in the hollows of his skull even when the wind was still. He'd spent the better part of the morning wrestling with the cryptic entries. Some passages were almost illegible, scrawled with an urgency that suggested a mind teetering on the edge. Others, however, began to coalesce into a terrifying narrative. He squinted at a recurring symbol, a jagged star-like shape, often drawn near mentions of the deep slumber and the old pact. He recognized fragments of local folklore, tales he'd dismissed as childish fables during his brief visits as a boy. The journal spoke of a sunken city, not a mythical Atlantis, but something more sinister. A place that existed not in legend, but in memory. A submerged ruin that whispered to those who listened too closely. It detailed rituals, ancient rites performed by the island's early inhabitants, sacrifices made to appease something. The ink blurred, his eyes burning with the strain. A pact. The word appeared again and again, sometimes underlined, sometimes circled. It wasn't a treaty between men, but a binding agreement with something vast, something hungry, something that lay waiting beneath the waves. It wasn't senility, Dean now realized. It was fear. A sudden gust rattled the window panes, and Dean flinched, his heart giving a jolt against his ribs. He stood, pacing the small room, the floorboards groaning under his weight. The the journal wasn't enough. He needed more. His gaze fell upon an old, leather-bound map tucked into the back of a dusty maritime almanac he'd found on a shelf. It depicted the island, but with strange, hand-drawn annotations. Swirling currents, X's marking uncharted underwater formations, and a curious faint line extending from the shore toward the deep, ending in that same jagged star-like symbol. And near the symbol, almost imperceptibly, was a faint, penciled note. Look to the light, the true light. The true light. Dean's thoughts immediately went to the abandoned lighthouse, a gaunt sentinel that stood on the island's highest, most treacherous promontory. He'd avoided it since arriving, a place of morbid curiosity and lingering unease. But his grandfather had been the keeper there for decades. If anyone had left further clues, it would be there. He pulled on his thickest jumper, the wool scratchy against his skin, and grabbed a powerful lantern. The air outside was dense and cloying, tasting of salt and decay. The fog was a living thing, swirling around him, snatching at the beam of his lantern. The path to the lighthouse was steeper than he remembered, a treacherous ascent of loose scree and slick rock. The wind howled, a mournful dirge, tugging at his clothes, trying to push his back. The iron door was rusted shut, but a side window, long shattered, offered a gaping maw into the desolate interior. He squeezed through, the jagged glass tearing at his jumper. Inside, the air was stagnant, thick with the smell of old rust and something else. Something cloying and ancient, like stagnant seawater and forgotten secrets. The spiral staircase, once meticulously maintained, was now a crumbling helix of iron and salt-eaten stone. Dust motes danced in the anemic light from his lantern, performing a silent, macabre ballet. The wind shrieked through the broken lantern room at the top, a spectral wail. There, amidst the shattered glass and corroded machinery, Dean found it. They were navigation maps, but marked with the same strange symbols from his grandfather's journal, charting not just depths, but currents of influence. One map, larger than the rest, had a massive circular area highlighted off the coast, directly above where the sunken city was implied. Exhaustion weighed him down, but sleep offered no respite. His dreams were a maelstrom of churning black water, of colossal, unseen shapes shifting beneath a phosphorescent surface. The dream culminated in a vision of himself, standing on the edge of a precipice, the black ocean stretching below, its surface now writhing with a faint greenish glow. He felt himself being pulled, drawn into the depths, a silent, terrible surrender. The hum of the dream still resonated in his ears, a phantom vibration. He swung his legs out of bed, his bare feet touching the rough floorboards. That's when he saw it. Near the leg of his bedside table, a cluster of something alien clung to the wood. It was a patch of algae, vibrant and ethereal, glowing with a soft, bioluminescent green. It pulsed, faintly, rhythmically, with a slow, deliberate beat that mirrored the hum from his dream. He hadn't noticed it before, and it certainly hadn't been there yesterday. He stared, mesmerized and horrified, as the light seemed to deepen, to draw him closer. It wasn't just on the floor. A faint, similar glow emanated from the cracks in the wall near the window, a network of luminous veins spreading through the old stone. The island was breathing, and it was exhaling something ancient and terrible into his home. The abandoned lighthouse. The phrase echoed in Dean's mind, a cold, insistent whisper. It had always been there, a gaunt sentinel on the island's highest, most treacherous promontory, a place he'd instinctively avoided. His grandfather had spent decades within its stark, cylindrical walls, tending the beacon, an isolated guardian against the relentless sea. What secrets had the old man kept? What truths had that solitary vigil revealed? He stood in the cottage's small, cluttered living area, the air suddenly thick and heavy, as if the very atmosphere had absorbed moisture from the depths. A low, resonant thrum began to permeate the floorboards. A vibration so subtle it felt more like a tremor within his own bones than an external sound. It wasn't a mechanical hum, nor the groan of the old house in the wind. This was organic, deep, and strangely wet, like some vast submerged engine turning slowly in the abyssal dark. Dean pressed his palm to the rough wooden table. The thrum vibrated there too, a silent pulse against his skin. He tried to dismiss it, to attribute it to the island's peculiar acoustics, the constant assault of the ocean. But then, a small, polished stone, a souvenir from some forgotten beach, slid silently across the mantelpiece, stopping just short of the edge. He hadn't touched it. No draft could have nudged it with such deliberate slowness. For a heartbeat, it wasn't his face staring back. His skin seemed to stretch and thin, pulling taut over sharp alien contours. Then, as quickly as it appeared, the distortion vanished, leaving behind his own weary, familiar visage. He blinked, splashed more water onto his face, convinced it was a trick of the dim light, a figment of his overwrought imagination. The incident spurred him to action. Dean's determination, usually channeled into the precise lines of his cartography, now focused on the cottage itself. He began to search, systematically, for anything his grandfather might have left behind. He started with the study, a small room crammed with dusty tomes, nautical charts, and strange calcified objects that looked like petrified barnacles. The air here was even heavier, charged with an inexplicable energy. The thrum intensified, a low hypnotic drone that threatened to lull him into a stupor, or perhaps to pull him deeper into its own rhythm. He ran his fingers along the rough-hewn beams that supported the low ceiling. Here, concealed beneath layers of grime and old varnish, he found them. Intricate, angular symbols carved directly into the wood. They weren't decorative. They were sharp, jagged, almost like teeth, repeating in a pattern that felt both protective and ominous. He recognized a few from obscure texts on folklore he'd once glanced at. Warding signs, meant to repel malevolent forces. But these felt different, older, imbued with a desperate primal energy. The pages were brittle, the ink faded, but the script was his grandfather's unmistakable hand. It wasn't a log of lighthouse duties, it was a desperate chronicle. The hunger grows, it demands. I give it the offerings, the lesser things, to keep it from the greater. The tether thins. The pact must be honored, or all will be consumed. Offerings, sacrifices. Dean looked around the study, at the calcified objects, at a small, lead-lined box in a corner. He opened the box. Inside, nestled on a bed of dried seaweed, were a collection of small, polished stones, a tangle of human hair, and a shriveled, mummified seabird, its wings outstretched in a silent, eternal scream. They weren't just curiosities. They were tokens, pleas, payments. His grandfather hadn't just been warding something off, he'd been feeding it. The hum was now a resonant chord, vibrating through the very air, through Dean's teeth, making his vision swim at the edges. He clutched the journal, his knuckles white. The cottage groaned, not with the familiar creaks of old timber, but with a deeper, more organic sound, like a living thing shifting its weight. He turned, his senses screaming a silent warning, and saw it. It wasn't solid, not entirely. It was vaguely humanoid in outline, yet impossibly fluid, like a column of churning dark water. It seemed to pulse, to breathe, and within its shifting form, Dean glimpsed glints of something hard and chitinous, like an exoskeleton or scales reflecting the sparse light. A faint, sickening scent of decay and crushed shellfish permeated the air, thick and cloying. It moved, not walking but flowing, gliding across the floorboards with a terrible, silent grace. It was coming for him. His heart hammered, a frantic drum against his ribs. He threw up his arm, shielding his face, and scrambled back, kicking at the floorboard he'd just opened, sending the journal skittering. The aqueous form paused, its head tilting, an action that was both unnervingly human and utterly alien. It seemed to contemplate him, to taste his fear. It had been there. It had been real. And it had almost touched him. The contents of the lead-lined box seemed to hum with a quiet malevolence. Dean stared at the shriveled seabird, its wings splayed in a silent final scream. Then at the tangle of dark human hair, coarse and stiff, and finally at the polished obsidian-like stones. They felt impossibly cold, even in the warmth of his palm. His stomach twisted. These weren't mere curiosities. They were instruments, offerings. He carefully placed the items back, the soft rustle of dried seaweed a stark contrast to the grim reality they represented, and closed the lid, sealing away the disturbing tableau. He returned to the journal, his hands trembling slightly as he turned the brittle pages. The cryptic entries he'd skimmed before now demanded his full attention. He found himself searching for connections, for the meaning behind the macabre collection in the box. His grandfather's looping script, once merely eccentric, now seemed charged with a desperate urgency. The cadence must be maintained. The deep calls always. It listens. It demands. Dean's breath hitched. He traced the words with a fingertip. This wasn't observation. This was involvement. His grandfather wasn't just a record keeper. He was an active participant. The realization hit him with the force of a physical blow. His grandfather hadn't been a mad recluse. He had been a guardian, performing a ritual, maintaining a pact. The offerings weren't just symbolic, they were functional. As he delved deeper, the journal began to speak of the deep song. It is not sound, not truly. It is a resonance, a vibration in the marrow. It seeks purchase in the mind, eroding the edges of what is real. The song, it pulls. A pressure built behind his eyes, a dull ache that spread through his skull. But the thrum intensified, a rhythmic pulse that seemed to resonate with the very foundation of the abandoned lighthouse. He gripped the edge of the desk, his knuckles white. The lamplight, which had been steady, now seemed to flicker, not with any visible draft, but as if the light source itself were struggling against an unseen current. Dean blinked hard, shaking his head. Hallucinations, he thought, born of exhaustion and morbid suggestion. The words on the page blurred, then reformed, his grandfather's script twisting into unfamiliar symbols for a terrifying second, before snapping back into legibility. Dean squeezed his eyes shut, trying to clear his head. He was losing his grip. The deep song. It was working on him, just as the journal described. He forced his gaze back to the page. His grandfather's final entries were scrawled in a frantic hand, almost illegible. The thrumming intensified, a deep, resonant hum that vibrated through the very soles of his boots. He had to find it. The answers, the terrifying, sanity-shattering answers, lay beneath him. He moved through the abandoned lighthouse, his steps heavy on the worn wooden stairs. He descended into the cellar, a vast circular space at the base of the tower, its walls rough-hewn rock, its floor a patchwork of uneven flagstones. His gaze swept over the ancient masonry, searching for any anomaly. The journal mentioned the lowest point, where the roots reach. He ran his hand along a section of the wall where the stones seemed to fit together too perfectly, a seam almost invisible. He pressed harder, feeling for a give, a subtle shift. Nothing. Then his fingers brushed against a faint indentation in the mortar, a small, almost imperceptible groove. He traced it, his heart hammering against his ribs, a frantic rhythm that fought against the encroaching deep song. The groove led to a small iron ring, cunningly disguised as part of the rough stone texture. It was barely visible, rusted and almost fused with the wall, With a grunt, Dean gripped it, pulling with all his might. A low, grinding groan filled the cellar, the sound of ancient stone complaining under duress. A section of the wall, perfectly camouflaged, swung inward with a heavy dragging motion, revealing a narrow, pitch-black opening. The thrumming was no longer a distant murmur. It had begun as a whisper, a strange echo in the depths of the old house. But now it filled the study, pressing in from all sides, a tangible weight on the air. He pushed away from the desk, the chair scraping loudly across the floor, the sound echoing unnaturally in the suddenly cavernous room. The answers, the terrifying truth, pulsed with the same rhythm that now hammered against his eardrums. His gaze swept the study, the heavy oak paneling, the towering bookshelves, the fireplace where embers had long since turned to ash. The sound seemed to emanate from everywhere and nowhere, a disorienting, omnipresent hum. But as he moved, a subtle shift occurred. Near the grand-grandfather clock, an antique whose pendulum had long been stilled, the vibrations intensified. He reached out, his fingers brushing against the cold, polished wood of the wall beside it. There, a faint tremor, distinct from the general thrumming. He pressed harder, his palm flattening against the paneling. A seam, almost invisible, ran vertically down the wall. This wasn't just old craftsmanship. It was deliberate concealment. His fingers explored the ornate carvings of the clock's base, searching for a latch, a button, anything. His index finger snagged on a minute, almost imperceptible protrusion within a carved rose motif. He pushed. A soft click broke through the thrumming. Every instinct screamed retreat, to seal the passage and pretend it had never existed. But the compulsion, the gnawing need to understand, was stronger. Stepping through the narrow opening, he found himself on a short, crumbling stone staircase descending into the earth. The passage was a crude tunnel, roughly hewn from the bedrock, barely wide enough for his shoulders. He could taste the salt on his tongue, feel the dampness clinging to his clothes. The thrumming was deafening now, a monstrous heartbeat echoing through the subterranean passage. The air grew thick, humid, like breathing through a wet cloth. Then, abruptly, the passage opened into a vast, cavernous space. He stood on a narrow ledge overlooking a colossal chamber. The thrumming here was overwhelming, a physical assault, making his teeth ache and his vision blur. In the center of the chamber, directly beneath where the abandoned lighthouse would stand above, was a colossal, obsidian-like monolith. It was not carved, but seemed to have grown organically from the bedrock, a jagged, multifaceted spire of impossible blackness. It wasn't just ancient, it was primordial. This was no mere artifact. This was a gateway, a focal point. He understood it instinctively, a horrifying clarity blooming in his mind. The thrumming emanated from it, a silent, cosmic scream. As he stared, transfixed by its terrible beauty, the air around the monolith shimmered, distorting, like heat haze over a desert road. Within the shimmering distortion, a vision bloomed. It wasn't a static image, but a terrifying, fluid nightmare. He saw the island, not as a remote haven, but as a feeding ground. The waters around it churned, not with natural currents, but with impossible, crushing pressures. The vision intensified, showing not just the island, but the vast, unknowable depths from which the entity had stirred. He saw glimpses of colossal, formless things, shapes that defied geometry, moving with slow, terrible grace in an endless, lightless ocean. He felt their immense, indifferent hunger, their ancient, patient malice. This wasn't just a creature of the deep. It was a fundamental force, a cosmic predator, whose awakening heralded the end of all he knew. The entity intended to consume, not just his sanity, but the island itself. He was not merely a witness, he was part of the process, a sacrifice, a bridge. He wasn't just discovering a secret, He was caught in its maw. He was here. He was seen, and it was waiting for him. It had begun as a whisper, a strange echo in the depths of the old house. But now it filled the study, pressing in from all sides, a tangible weight. It wasn't merely sound, it was a pressure, a force attempting to displace the air in his lungs, to flatten the walls around him. He felt it in the tremor of the floorboards beneath his feet, in the rattle of the window panes, in the very fillings of his teeth. The old cottage groaned, a tortured beast succumbing to an unseen assailant. Panic, cold and sharp, clawed at his throat. This wasn't just an external threat anymore. He stumbled back from the desk, knocking over the heavy, ink-stained lamp. The thrumming intensified, a guttural, hungry sound, as if something vast and ancient was attempting to breathe through the very fabric of his reality. He pressed his hands to his ears, but the sound bypassed his eardrums, echoing directly inside his skull. This was it. This was what the journal had warned about. Not just the encroaching fog, not just the strange visions, but this direct assault, this attempt to breach the final barrier. He imagined vast, unblinking eyes staring at him through the thin veil of reality, its immense form stirring just beyond the edge of his sight. His gaze darted to the journal, lying open on the desk, its aged pages fluttering slightly in the trembling air. He lunged for it, his fingers fumbling with the brittle parchment. The thrumming roared, a soundless scream inside his head, threatening to shatter his sanity. His eyes scanned the faded script, desperate for an answer, a reprieve. He flipped through pages, ignoring the earlier entries about strange currents and vanishing ships, focusing solely on the latter, more cryptic passages. Words like binding, warding, severance caught his attention, scrawled alongside crude diagrams that looked like constellations or complex sigils. Then he saw it. A series of entries, increasingly frantic, detailing the entity's growing power, its relentless hunger. His grandfather had been consumed by this, had tried to fight it. Not to destroy, for it cannot be destroyed, but to seal. The ancient pact demands a price, a terrible exchange, life for stillness, a light for the deep's endless night. Not a life taken, but a life given, a severing, a final absolute surrender of that which anchors one to the world. The heart of the light must be extinguished by the keeper's hand, the blood of the line, the ultimate sacrifice, to ensure the long sleep. Dean's breath hitched. The heart of the light, by the keeper's hand. He reread the words, his mind reeling. He knew what the heart of the light referred to. The lamp, the very beacon of the abandoned lighthouse, the one thing his grandfather had tended religiously. But what did extinguished by the keeper's hand mean? And a life given, a severing, a final absolute surrender of that which anchors one to the world. The thrumming was no longer just a sound. It was an invasion. He gasped, stumbling back, clutching the journal like a shield. The journal hinted at something there, something vital to this desperate, terrible plan. The blood of the line? His blood? His grandfather's blood? The implication was horrifying, a sacrifice so profound it twisted his stomach into knots. He didn't understand the full scope of it, but the words ultimate sacrifice resonated with an icy clarity. He was trapped, cornered, and the only escape involved a choice he wasn't sure he could make. He looked around the trembling study, the air thick with the entity's predatory presence. He had no other choice. The abandoned lighthouse was his only hope, and perhaps his tomb. The heart of the light must be extinguished by the keeper's hand. The words, scrawled in his grandfather's frantic script, burned behind Dean's eyes. He traced the faded ink with a trembling finger, the meaning settling over him like a shroud of damp earth. The lamp, the very beacon in the abandoned lighthouse, the one thing his grandfather had tended with a devotion bordering on obsession. To extinguish it, to snuff out its vital spark. A low, guttural moan rumbled from the island's core, vibrating through the cottage's stone foundation. It wasn't the wind, though the gale outside had become a shrieking banshee, tearing at the eaves. This was deeper, a sound that seemed to originate not from air, but from the very rock beneath his feet. The sky was no longer merely overcast. It was a churning bruise of bruised purples and sickly greens, streaked with impossible flashes of something that wasn't lightning. The sea, usually a tempestuous but predictable force, now writhed with an unnatural energy, its waves rearing like monstrous skeletal hands clawing at the shore. It was a cloying metallic scent, like old blood mixed with ozone and the sweet decay of forgotten things. He could feel it now, not just as a distant dread, but as a palpable pressure against his skull, a cold, vast intelligence pressing in from all sides. Whispers, faint and formless, seemed to slither from the cracks in the walls, promising oblivion, promising peace in the depths. He shoved the journal back into his satchel, his movements jerky. This wasn't just a storm. The island was transforming, groaning under the entity's awakening. He'd noticed it on his last walk along the bluffs. The kelp beds had grown impossibly dense, pulsing with a faint phosphorescent glow. The usually sturdy gulls circled erratically, their cries distorted, sometimes sounding less like birds and more like choked gasps. The very stones of the ancient sea wall seemed to weep a viscous, oily black liquid that smelled like a dying ocean. He was the last keeper, the last link in a broken chain. His grandfather had left him this burden, this terrible inheritance. He had to see it through. He would see it through. Dean pulled the journal out again, flipping to the last few pages, his fingers stained with the grime of the old book. A vessel. A conduit for the severance. A vessel. A conduit. The words twisted in his gut. It wasn't just about turning off a lamp. It was about severing a connection, breaking a pact that had been maintained for generations, a pact that had kept the entity at bay. And the cost. The immense personal cost. His grandfather had hinted at it, warned of a sacrifice not of blood, but of self. To become empty, to be a conduit. It meant opening himself, allowing something to pass through him, something that would leave him irrevocably changed, perhaps broken, perhaps absorbed. The entity wanted a way in, and the counter-ritual was a desperate gamble that might give it a different kind of access, a different kind of victory. He remembered the old man's haunted eyes, the way he'd sometimes stare out at the sea for hours, as if waiting for a final, inevitable reckoning. Now, Dean understood. His grandfather hadn't just been maintaining a light. He'd been maintaining a prison, and Dean was now tasked with demolishing one of its crucial walls. He gathered what he needed: the journal, his grandfather's old heavy brass lantern, a coil of stout rope, and a single rusted iron pry bar he'd found in the shed. These were his tools, his meager armaments against an ancient, hungry force. The wind immediately ripped at his clothes, trying to tear him from his feet. The air vibrated with a low hum, a sound that seemed to bypass his ears and resonate directly in his bones. The path to the abandoned lighthouse was barely visible, swallowed by the unnatural twilight and the thrashing vegetation. Twisted forms of seaweed, thicker than his arm, snaked across the rocky ground, seeming to writhe and recoil from his approach. The very ground seemed to shift beneath his boots. He stumbled over something soft and yielding, a patch of what looked like moss, but it squelched beneath his weight and emitted a faint, sickly sweet odor. He didn't dare look too closely. The island was alive with the entity's presence. Every rock, every patch of soil, every gust of wind imbued with its malevolent will. Its silhouette was distorted by the driving rain and the strange, shimmering currents in the air, making it appear to sway, to breathe. As he drew closer, the faint, almost imperceptible hum intensified, thrumming against his teeth, rattling his vision. The light at its apex, long dormant, seemed to pulse with a faint, internal glow, a mocking echo of the power he was meant to sever. His own mind felt stretched, thin, on the verge of snapping. But Dean pushed through it, one heavy boot after another, the metallic tang of fear sharp on his tongue. And he was walking towards the heart of it, towards the abandoned lighthouse, towards the final terrible act of a keeper's hand. And he was ready to give it. The wind, a banshee shriek in the black, tore at Dean's oilskin, whipping strands of soaked hair across his eyes. He leaned into the gale, each step a battle against the sheer force of the storm, his boots sinking into the sodden earth of the island path. The beam from his lantern, a struggling circle of pale yellow, cut through the impenetrable gloom, revealing glimpses of gnarled, salt-blasted shrubs clinging to the cliff edge. Ahead, the abandoned lighthouse stood, a skeletal finger against the churning sky, its granite skin glistening with rain. It wasn't just a structure. It was a monument to generations of vigilance, a sentinel against the encroaching void. And tonight, it was a battleground. The air around the tower felt thick, charged, like the moments before lightning struck, but without the relief of thunder. He pushed open the heavy barnacled door, the ancient iron groaning in protest. The circular stairwell spiraled upwards into the blackness, each step a worn slab of granite, slick with moisture. The silence was unnerving, broken only by the distant roar of the ocean and the rattle of the wind against the thick glass of the lantern room high above. But it wasn't truly silent. A subtle vibration resonated through the stone, a deep, resonant hum that seemed to originate from the very foundations of the island. A sound that vibrated not in his ears, but in his chest cavity, in the marrow of his bones. It was the entity, fully manifested, a presence so vast and ancient it defied comprehension. As he climbed, the psychological assault began. They weren't words he recognized, but a cacophony of distorted pleas, ancient chants, and the sound of something vast and heavy dragging itself across an unseen floor. A vessel. The lantern light seemed to dim, struggling against an unseen force. The walls of the lighthouse pulsed with a faint phosphorescent glow, revealing the crude, etched symbols his grandfather had scratched into the stone. Protective runes, now flickering as if struggling for existence. And the lighthouse, this very structure, was the final lock. Reaching the top, he stumbled into the lamp room. The vast, empty chamber was a maelstrom of sensory distortion. The air shimmered, thick with a metallic tang that made his tongue feel numb. The floor beneath his feet felt like a living thing, rippling and shifting, making it difficult to maintain balance. The wind howled through unseen cracks, but it carried new sounds now. The groan of immense pressure, the guttural cries of something truly primordial, and the horrifying rhythmic thrum-thrum of a colossal heart beating somewhere beneath the waves, echoing the tremor in his own chest. The entity was here. Not a shape, not a form he could describe, but a crushing weight. An omnipresent awareness that pressed in on him from every direction, threatening to flatten him into the very stone. It was pure, unadulterated consciousness, ancient and hungry, focused entirely on him. He staggered toward the central pedestal, where the great lamp should have been. This was the true conduit, the heart of the pact. And now it was fully open, threatening to spill its horrors onto the island, onto the world. His grandfather's final cryptic note materialized in his mind, not as a memory, but as a vivid, undeniable truth. To sever the connection, you must offer a part of yourself. The lamp is a symbol. The true binding is blood. Dean understood. The pact wasn't maintained by merely keeping the lamp lit. It was maintained by a life, by a continuous generational sacrifice. His grandfather hadn't just been a keeper, he had been a living link, a vessel. And now, that responsibility had fallen to Dean. His hands shook as he fumbled for the small, ornate dagger his grandfather had left tucked beneath a loose floorboard in the cottage. He had dismissed it as an antique curio. "Join us. Surrender. There is no escape. Let the sorrow consume you." Images flashed before his eyes. His loved one, lost to the waves, now smiling eerily, beckoning him into the swirling maw. He would not surrender. He would not become another link in this chain of misery. He would break it, whatever the cost. He pressed the tip of the dagger against his palm. The cut was swift, a sharp sting, and a bead of crimson welled up. The moment the blood broke skin, the entire chamber convulsed. The thrumming intensified, becoming a deafening roar. The floor bucked violently, throwing him off balance. The effect was instantaneous and terrifying. The iridescent vortex shrieked, a sound of pure agony and rage, not of a physical being, but of something vast and elemental being torn apart. The air grew impossibly heavy, pushing down on him, trying to crush him. He felt his own essence, his very being pulled, stretched, as if a part of him was being ripped away, consumed by the portal. He squeezed his eyes shut, forcing himself to focus, to push through the agony. He wasn't just offering blood, he was offering his will, his determination to break the cycle. He was offering his future, his peace, perhaps even his sanity, to sever this ancient, unholy connection. The weight of the world, of generations of unspeakable horror, pressed down on him, threatening to shatter him. He felt a profound sense of loss, not just of blood, but of something deeper, something vital, being drained away. Then, as suddenly as it began, the shriek cut off. The thrumming faded, replaced by a low, mournful moan that echoed through the stone. The shimmering, iridescent maw in the center of the room began to shrink, to recede, pulling back into itself with a sound like a vast, ancient door grinding shut. The phosphorescent glow on the walls died. The metallic tang in the air dissipated, leaving only the scent of salt and old stone. Dean lay there, gasping, his hand throbbing, his mind reeling. The portal was gone, replaced by the empty, solid pedestal where the lamp should have been. He had done it. He had sealed the connection. But the cost? He was still in the lighthouse, but he was no longer quite himself. He was a survivor, yes, but forever altered. A silent testament to the immense personal cost of breaking an ancient pact. His hands shook as he understood, the metallic tang of fear sharp on his tongue. The waves, crashing against the cliffs below, had ceased to be mere sound. They were a throbbing pulse, a rhythm in his skull, the deep song's relentless chorus, louder now than ever before. It wasn't just outside, it was resonating within him, echoing in the hollow chambers of his chest. Dean stared at the immense, tarnished brass and crystal mechanism of the lamp. It wasn't just a light source, he realized with a sickening lurch of his gut. It was a focal point, a conduit. His grandfather hadn't simply tended the lamp. He had been part of it. Their essence, their sanity, their very self was the fuel. The generational sacrifice wasn't a ritual performed for the lighthouse. It was a sacrifice to the lighthouse, to the entity it held captive. A guttural cry threatened to tear from his throat. The instinct was primal, overwhelming. He could still try. The small boat bobbed at the dock, a fragile promise of escape. But where would he go? It was a resonant hum within his bones, a tendril already wrapped around the core of his being. He stumbled back, his shoulder hitting the rough stone wall of the abandoned lighthouse. A loose sheet of parchment, tucked into a crack, fluttered to the floor. It was his grandfather's familiar spidery hand. a final cryptic message, scrawled beneath a crude drawing of the lighthouse. The burden is the gift. The gift. The true horror blossomed in his mind then, a black flower unfurling its petals. His grandfather hadn't merely kept the entity contained. He had absorbed its essence, acted as a living prison, a psychic barrier. It didn't want to destroy the world. It wanted to join it, to spread its influence, to twist reality into its own image. And the keepers, generation after generation, had offered themselves as the solitary, agonizing point of contact, taking the full brunt of its terrible song, containing its madness within their own minds. He was the next link. There was no escaping this. The entity had chosen him, drawn him here, played on his grief, eroded his defenses. He moved towards the colossal lamp, his steps heavy, like a man walking through deep water. He placed both hands on the brass casing, the intricate gears and lenses looming over him like the skeletal remains of some ancient mechanical god. As he pressed his palms against the frigid surface, a faint hum began, not mechanical, but resonant, deeply internal. It wasn't a choice, not truly. It was a surrender, a slow, insidious merging. His own thoughts, his memories, his very sense of self began to thin, to stretch, to become porous, like a dissolving map. It was no longer outside him. It was within him, an alien consciousness settling into the deepest recesses of his mind, making itself at home. His body remained standing, rigid, fixed before the lamp. But the man who stood there was no longer entirely Dean. His eyes, fixed on the churning gray expanse of the ocean visible through the high windows, held an unnerving clarity, a profound, terrible understanding that transcended human experience. The immediate threat, the encroaching madness, had receded from the island, from the world. It was contained, yes, but at an unimaginable cost. He was the new sentinel. He was the anchor. The waves crashed below, a familiar sound now, but no longer a threat. They were just part of the endless, watchful vigil he had unknowingly inherited, a prison he had willingly, tragically stepped into.